we're talking today about Heinrich Himmler. I've got several pictures of him dead lying on the floor, which is the first part of what I'm going to be talking to you about. And I've got a few pictures of him alive. Here we have Heinrich Himmler. He's the gentleman here on the right of the picture, a little bit shorter than the gentleman here. If I show this to the average American audience, it contains a few gun show enthusiasts and military buffs, and they leap on this man and say, oh, look at that uniform. Yes, that's a regular Ordnungspolizei uniform, silver braid, so he's certain at a rank. He's a major of the Ordnungspolizei. Oh, and behind him, Berlin traffic cops, regular German police, Ordnungspolizei. Oh, and look behind them, six-wheeled, open cross-country vehicles, regularly used by Heinrich Himmler and his men. Oh, Mark 21 or whatever it is, to know all the numbers of all these things. Military enthusiasts at these gun shows and auctions, they know far more than the average historian when it comes to guns and daggers and badges and things. I know a bit more than them when it comes to looking at documents. And it's looking at documents that are really at the root of the narration of what I'm going to be telling you about Heinrich Himmler. Here he is in Warsaw. It's the summer. You can see that because you can see the lines where his eyeglasses have been on his cheeks. The sunburn is shadowed out. It's probably 1939, October 1939, just after the Germans invaded Poland. He's talking to one of his police majors. He's aged about 39 or 40 there, and 4 years later he's dead. 5 years later he's dead. At the age of 44, Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in Europe, has achieved all he achieved, and yet he's dead at the age of 44. And if you look at what he actually achieved, he was the man who created the Waffen-SS from nothing, effectively from nothing. When he took over the SS, there were 100 men in it. He sacked 50 of them straight away and rebuilt, and took only the elite, only the very best, only the ones he wanted. The SA, the brown shirts, his rivals, they were quite happy to take anybody who wanted to sign up and join. They were interested in numbers. He wanted quality. And he built a quality SS, literally Schutzstaffel. And after that, from that, he then created the Waffen-SS. And the Waffen-SS was the armed wing of the SS. Eventually, 1 million men under arms in 1944. And it became the most formidable fighting force in Europe in World War II. When there was a gap on the front line that needed plugging, they sent for the SS, the Waffen-SS. They were the men on whom you could rely. They fought to the death, as symbolized by the death's head badge on their caps. An ancient German military symbol going back to the time of Frederick the Great, in fact. The skull and crossbones on their caps indicating a willingness to die in battle, which made them a very fearsome enemy indeed. I've not met any British generals or American officers who didn't express the utmost respect in privacy for the Waffen-SS. When I was a steelworker in Germany in 1959, 1960, my foreman, Adolf Saxler, he invited me around to tea one afternoon, and there was a Waffen-SS man there with him, one of his close friends, scar across his chest. I said, you got that in battle? He said, no, that was in training. We trained with live ammunition. You would have to lie on your back and riddle 200 or 300 yards across a field beneath a machine gun firing live machine gun bursts at a height of 13 inches above the ground. And I guess he was 13.5 inches. Yeah. Anyway, he got this burst across his chest. And he still had that 20 years later when I was a steelworker in Germany. They were tough men. The Waffen-SS. Heinrich Himmler built that. He was the commander-in-chief of the Waffen-SS. He commanded it for Hitler, men of absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Hitler and to the German cause. He was also the mastermind of the Holocaust, whatever that was. And I'm not going to use that word very much in this evening's talk. I'm going to be looking at it so we can see what we can believe actually happened. But after that, I'll move on. The third part of my talk, I'm going to be looking at his childhood, where he came from, who Heinrich Himmler was, who his brother was, the strange things that little Heine, the middle brother of 3, did to Gebhard. And finally, I'm going to ask a very interesting question. What did Heinrich Himmler know about the coming bomb plot against Adolf Hitler in advance? Did he know it was coming? Did he know they were going to try and kill Hitler? Did he stand back and rock backwards and forwards on his heels and say, well, very interesting, I'm in a win-win situation? If they get him, then I'm next in line for the top job. If they don't get him and I manage to catch them all red-handed, then I'm the hero. So this is a very interesting question, and the documents there are very compelling. But first of all, I'm going to start off by looking at the end, the very last minutes of his life. Heinrich Himmler, chief of the SS, was dead at 11:15 p.m. on the evening of May the 23rd, 1945. The war had been over for 2 or 3 weeks by then. At the end of the war, he was up near Denmark, near the Danish frontier, with a dwindling band of men, with 150 men altogether. He had his bodyguard with him, his escort troops, his detectives, his secretaries, his code breakers, the clerks, and the drivers, And one by one he sent them all home until 2 weeks later he's left there just with his two closest friends, his adjutants, SS Major Macher and SS Major Grootman. I knew them both. They're both dead now, of course, along with their boss. They last saw him on the evening of May the 23rd, 1945, when they ran into a British Army patrol on a bridge as they began their long journey south. He was trying to get back home to Munich, where he was born. And he was heading south on foot with his two trusty adjutants when they stumbled into a British Army patrol on the bridge at Bremerförde, who looked at their papers and immediately arrested them because their fake papers, their false identity papers, were made out as German military police, which was an automatic arrest category, stupidly enough. So they were automatically arrested and taken to a prison camp at Westerdimke nearby. The commandant of that camp was Captain Sylvester. These two men languished in his camp, the three men languished in the camp for 2 or 3 days, and eventually Heinrich Himmler got tired of that, and he went to the commandant, Sylvester, and said, "I am really Heinrich Himmler." And he then signed his name on a piece of paper to prove it, the familiar jagged script, Heinrich Himmler, Gothic script, which very few Germans nowadays can read. So the commandant, Sylvester, telephoned British Army headquarters in nearby Lüneburg and said, "We've got a big one here, we've got Heinrich Himmler. No doubt about it. I've seen him and I think he's Himmler." And the colonel in charge of the intelligence unit at British Army headquarters, Colonel Murphy, immediately said, "I'll come over and pick him up." Now, I've got Murphy's account of this. He wrote a handwritten account at that time. And in the handwritten account, he says, "I got the phone call from Westerdimke, and I said, I'll come straight over with a couple of staff officers and pick him up." And I drove over with a couple of staff officers to Westerdimke and picked up Himmler, and we drove him to a house we had prepared for the purpose. Strange wording. It's almost as though there's something he wants to say but can't. And we do know that everyone who was in that house was sworn to official secrets by having to sign the British Official Secrets Act on the following day. There was something they saw or knew about that they weren't allowed to talk about ever for the rest of their lives under pain of imprisonment. If you go to YouTube, go to the internet, you will see there's a picture of me standing outside that house, a film of me standing outside that house in June 2010 with Janelle, my assistant then. She took it. And I'm talking about what went on in that room behind me, the one with the big bay windows, the discrepancies, the things that don't fit. I wanted to see the house myself. It was quite a risk. Had the German police picked me up and asked to see my papers, it would have been an automatic arrest also, because I'm banned from Germany in the interest of the German people. Ever since 1993, the German government handed me a letter banning me in the interest of the German people. And it means, of course, effectively in the interest of a certain group of German people, but not the German people as such, all of whom were my best admirers and friends. But I had to see the house because I wanted to see which way that window pointed. You'll understand why in a minute. Colonel Murphy, anyway, he writes in his account, I went over and picked him up, put him on the back seat of my car, and the official version of the story is that Himmler in that house shortly after managed to bite on a cyanide capsule which he concealed at the back of his mouth despite all the efforts of the doctors, and he was dead. I'm going to play to you now a 3-minute BBC recording of a British Army officer who was in the camp at that time in that house, and he was a witness of Himmler's death.
Hello BBC, this is Chester Wilmot speaking from Lüneburg, where Himmler committed suicide last night. One of the men with him in the room at the time, at 31 Ulsener Strasse, was Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of Mortlake in Surrey. And I've brought him to the microphone to tell you what happened. Sergeant Major Austin.
Before I arrived, I didn't know it was Himmler. I was only told there was an important prisoner whom I was to guard. As he came into the room, not the arrogant figure which we all know, but dressed in an army shirt, a pair of underpants with a blanket wrapped round him, I immediately recognized him as Himmler. Speaking to him in German and pointing to an empty couch, I said, "That's your bed. Get undressed." He looked at me and then looked at an interpreter and said, "He doesn't know who I am." I said, "Yes, I do. You're Himmler. But still, that's your bed. Get undressed." He tried to stare me out, but I stared at him back. And eventually he dropped his eyes and sat down on the bed and started to take off his underpants. The doctor and the colonel then came into the room and started to carry out a routine inspection, looking for poison, which we suspected he probably had on him. He looked between his toes, all over his body, under his armpits, in his ears, behind his ears, in his hair, and then he came to his mouth. He asked Himmler to open his mouth. He did, and he ran his tongue around his lips quite easily, but the doctor wasn't satisfied. He asked him to come nearer to the light. He came nearer to the light and opened his mouth. The doctor tried to put 2 fingers into his mouth to have a good look inside, I suspected. And Himmler drew his head away and, clamping down on the doctor's fingers, crushed the phial of poison which he had been carrying in his mouth for hours. The doctor said, "He's done it." And the colonel and I instinctively jumped to him. The doctor held him by the throat as he was falling and tried to make him spit out the poison which he was swallowing, and the colonel and I held him. After a struggle lasting a quarter of an hour, in which we tried all methods of artificial respiration under the direction of the doctor, he died. And when he died, we threw a blanket over him and left him.
That's the official British version. The interview with Sergeant Major Edwin Austin on the day after the death of Heinrich Himmler. He's word perfect. I think you may agree that he's probably reading from a script. The script has been adapted slightly for the American audience. Chester Wilmot has obviously said to him, "Look here, old chap, this is the BBC. It's going to be broadcast all around the world, including the United States, and they sometimes use different words from us, regular chaps. So we say sofa, they say couch, we say pants, they say underpants. If you just say Himmler stood there in his pants, meaning underpants, the Americans are going to say, so what? No, you've got to say underpants." So you can hear how Austin actually pauses. He was standing there in his underpants. I pointed at the couch. So I think it's all been written, and he's been very careful he's been very careful to stick to the script, because he too is now subject to the Official Secrets Act. My warning here is, don't believe very much of what you've just heard him say. I think there's something very different happened to Himmler in that house, and the evidence is quite strong. First of all, for Himmler to have concealed a poison capsule in his mouth, where the doctor saw glinting at the back of the mouth, and then managing to crush it with his teeth, is completely unlikely. I'll show you first of all what these capsules look like. That's what the cyanide capsule looks like. Standard German issue cyanide capsule. This one was taken from Hermann Goering's property. This is the capsule there. It's 1.5 inches long, thin glass, carried around normally in a brass cartridge case with a screw cap, because you don't want the thing breaking in your pocket with nasty consequences. So you carried it in your pocket. You didn't carry it in your mouth, except when you were very close to the end. And the evidence is that Himmler didn't have that in his mouth. In fact, he didn't have it at all when he was sitting in that car driving the short distance from Westertimke to Lüneburg. We know that because Colonel Murphy, in his handwritten account, says, "I sat on the back seat of the car with Heinrich Himmler, one of my staff officers, and I chatted with him all the way for the 10-minute journey. And Himmler ate a British Army sandwich that had been given to him." Now, British Army sandwich, the Canadians will probably know this, the Americans won't. The Americans, you're accustomed when you have a sandwich, it's made of something like thick wads of Kleenex. British bread is so, if the sandwich doesn't kill you, then believe me, the cyanide capsule would have if you tried eating that sandwich with a cyanide capsule concealed in your mouth. And besides that, we know that even when they left the house, Heinrich Himmler hadn't got that cyanide capsule in him. Well, there's now a picture of the same cyanide capsule in somebody's hand. It's a big thing. You can't conceal it inside a hollow tooth, which is one version. You can't conceal it between 2 teeth at the back of your mouth. You can't do any of those things. Even then, you can only do that if you actually got one. And we do know that when Himmler identified himself to Captain Sylvester in the Westertimke camp said, he called in a couple of officers and he said to Himmler, "You will go to that corner of the room, take all your clothes off, then walk to this corner of the room naked and put on British clothing." And one of the officers described that in a report which is in the British files. It says, "We made him undress, We went through his clothing, his own clothing. We found his cyanide capsule, and I gave it to you, sir, to Colonel Murphy. Colonel Murphy was carrying that cyanide capsule in his pocket when he sat in that car. Heinrich Himmler didn't have one concealed about him in his mouth or anywhere else. And quite apart from that, well, let's find out who Colonel Murphy is. Colonel Murphy, there's a famous painting, an oil painting, of the surrender on Lüneburg Heath. Field Marshal Montgomery, the British Army commander, accepting the surrender of the German generals on Lüneburg Heath, painted by British war artists, and very good war artists. And in the back of that painting, you can see a British Army colonel standing there. That's Colonel Murphy, with the red hat band and all the rest. That's Colonel Murphy. He managed to wangle his way into the painting because he, as he said to Montgomery, I'm the one who brought this surrender about. I'm the one who carried the messages to and fro. I have a right to be in the painting. And he's also in another painting later on, which I'll talk about. The same guy. That capsule was not in Heinrich Himmler's possession. So what happened in that room? Well, the doctor gave a description also, which I've also got. The doctor says, I made Heinrich Himmler take all his clothes off, I searched him, and it's very similar to the version that Austin gives in that BBC interview. I searched him, I looked in his mouth, and I thought I saw something glinting at the back of the mouth. I asked him to come over to the light and look in his mouth, except in his version, Austin says, the doctor told him to come over to the light. The doctor himself, in his version of this, he writes, I asked him to come over to the window so I could get a better look in his mouth. And everyone's believed that, except it's 11 p.m. at night. There is no window, there's no light coming through that window. I know I've stood outside that house for that very purpose. I wanted to see which way it faced, wanted to see whether there were any street lamps outside, even if the street lamps would have been working 1 week after the war was over, effectively. It was the only house that wasn't destroyed by bombing. That's why the British had taken it over for their intelligence unit, for this purpose. There was no. Why did the doctor lie? Well, it's possible that he wanted to cover up the fact that he wanted Himmler just to stand in the room with his back to everybody in the room for some reason, while the doctor told him to open his mouth for some purpose. But as a historian, I don't always join the dots. All I can say is this and that, and I leave my readers to come up with possible conclusions. We do have the record, the war diary of the unit that ran that house. It was called the British Second Army Defence Company, an intelligence unit. It ran that house. They kept a war diary on printed British Army war diary paper. I've got a few pages of it here. There's only 3 pages from May 1945. You can see that here. There are 3 pages like this. I've got the other 2 pages here. They're important because page 1 describes what happened on the first 3 weeks of May 1945, how they brought in other prisoners to that house. Kurt Daluger, he was brought in, he was sent back to England. The famous German police chief, number 2 under Himmler, sent back to England for interrogation and eventually turned over to the Czechs, who strangled him to death a year or 2 later. Kurt Daluger, SS Gruppenführer Pritzmann, he was brought into that house. He emerged feet first, dead like Himmler. Bit of a coincidence, that. Lord Haw was brought in, the famous British traitor. William Joyce was brought in. His wife came into that house. That's on the first page of this war diary. You see, it's a printed form. Left-hand column says date and time. Middle column says what's happening. You'll understand why in a minute. The third column lists any kind of telegrams and appendices to be looked at. Page 2 describes the death of Himmler on 23rd of May 1945, the official version. Page 3 describes what happened thereafter. For example, Himmler's brother is brought in, Gebhard. Then they take fingerprints of the body. The body lies on the floor for 3 days. I've got a number of photographs here of the body lying on the floor. It's interesting. I'll show them to you briefly, and you can look at them afterwards when we come to an interval. There's Himmler lying on the floor, British official photograph, lying on the floor wearing glasses. Oh, they're not his glasses. They've just been put on his face for some reason. Probably so he looks like Heinrich Himmler. There's another photograph of him lying on the floor. He's not moved, of course, very much. A bowl of water there, as though something has been mopped up. You begin looking then, like CSI, looking for all the details. There he is lying on the floor again. Same room, same position, arms folded on his face, still wearing the glasses. He's there for 3 days altogether. And you wonder why. British officers sitting around him, the body lying on the floor, still there. Another picture of Himmler lying on the floor. Rather a better one, that one. And then a picture taken by a British soldier who walked past the house one night and decided to have a look through the window, and there he sees him lying on the floor. So he and a mate, they jump in through the window with a box Brownie camera, proper light up, proper old Heine up against the chair to get a better picture of him, and they take this picture. I've got a couple of other pictures too. Himmler lies on that floor for 3 days, as is evidenced by the war diary. And then American officers are brought in on the second day to satisfy themselves that Heinrich Himmler has been caught, that he is now dead. And they stand around the body. There's a photograph of them standing around the body. The American officers, high-ranking general, saying, well, it sure looks like Heine to me, and he's certainly not moving very much. And then the Russians are brought in, and there's a picture of the Russians standing next to the body. And they say that, yes, he does appear to be dead. Mr. Himmler, in Russian they will say Himmler. And then the body is wrapped up. After a few more testimony, they take fingerprints of the body. You've seen that on CSI, of course. Somebody has to take the fingerprints. The brain is removed and sent to England for some reason. Robert Lai, his brain was sent to England, and Mussolini's brain was sent to England for testing as well. And a death mask is taken. You know, a plaster cast is made of the dead face. And I've got a picture of it here. Heinrich Himmler dead, the plaster cast. I've shown this to a forensic pathologist, and he said, oh boy, he's been badly beaten, hasn't he? I said, oh? Oh yes, he said, look how the right-hand side of the face is swollen, and the eye is cut and already bloated. And well, that hadn't occurred to me. It was interesting to know. And then the body is wrapped in a blanket and tied up with telephone wire, neck, waist, and feet, and loaded onto the back of a pickup truck and taken out and buried at sea. Oh no, that was Bin Laden. Taken out and buried in the middle of the Lüneburg Heath after midnight one night. Who buries bodies in the middle of a heath after midnight? Murderers do that kind of thing. The British Army, they've got one of the most important prisoners ever. And he's not taken back to England. He emerges from that house feet first and dead. And he's then buried in the middle of the heath. We wonder why. And we begin to get closer to the story when we examine that war diary again of the unit. We find that page 2, the page describing the death of Heinrich Himmler, has been retyped by someone. If you look at the original documents, that's what I'm good at. You look at original documents, you can see who's typed it. Because each typist has their own characteristics. And for some reason, that page describing Heinrich Himmler's death has been retyped by somebody who uses the figure 1 and the figure 0 when typing dates, whereas page 1 and page 3, the person uses the little l and the capital O when typing dates. And various other idiosyncrasies that people have, like 2 or 3 spaces after a period. You can see that whoever did page 2, describing the death of Heinrich Himmler, has retyped it. For some reason, at the same time, because it's the same typewriter, you can see the damage to some keys. It's the same time because you can see it's from the same pad of paper, and the ribbon isn't kind of darker or lighter. So around roughly the same time, for some reason, somebody ordered page 2 to be retyped. And people don't like retyping pages, not when it's got as many words as that on, about 50 lines of text. They will cross out lines, and they'll initial in the margin. The crossing out is official. But this was something that nobody must ever be able to read, and so they crossed it out and retyped the page. And we only can begin to guess what it is when we begin adding further evidence. And the next piece of evidence I'd give you is completely valueless. Ask any judge. The book was published in 1980 called The Illustrated History of the Waffen-SS. It's quite a well-known book with all the kind of coffee table pictures that military enthusiasts and history buffs like. Pictures of top SS generals and Heinrich Himmler reviewing troops, and daggers and guns and badges, and all the famous names, Sepp Dietrich, Hauser, Otto Skorzeny, and all the rest. And right at the back of the book there is this picture of Heinrich Himmler lying on the floor. The commander of the SS, Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler, May the 23rd, 1945, succeeded in swallowing cyanide and escaping justice. And a friend of mine, Steve Kerr, took this book out of Coventry Public Library in the late 1980s. It's just been published. He took it out of Coventry Public Library, took it home and got to that page, and he found that somebody had written in the margin, next to that photograph, which describes the official version of how Himmler committed suicide with a concealed cyanide capsule, thereby escaping justice. And somebody has written in the left-hand margin, that's not what happened. I know I was in that room. Sergeant Major Austin beat him to death. Wow. And I can understand at this moment any British judge would interrupt me immediately and say, Mr. Irving, go no further. You must realize that what you have just said has no evidentiary value whatsoever. An anonymous remark by somebody who's not even prepared to sign his name, claiming to have been in that room, totally reversing the official British version of what happened. Members of the jury will disregard what Mr. Irving... I mean, this will be stricken from the record. This is the kind of thing that happen in a court of law, but we're not in a court of law. We're looking here at history. And you have to start looking at human people. And you can imagine how some regular British Army soldier, who was one of the people in that room that night, who's been told that if he reveals what he saw, he will be sent to prison, doesn't want to die with that knowledge on his conscience. And so he's borrowed that book from the library, and he finds there's the same old story being trotted out, and they're getting away with it. And he writes in the margin, that's not what happened. I know, I was in that. And he puts the book back in the library, and he says, there you are, my conscience is clear now. That's what I think happened. Being human, as you are as a historian, you understand why people do things. And later on I'm going to suggest the same humanity comes into the reason why I write the books. The NRA has a very interesting slogan that they use, which is, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that's a pretty good guideline when you're looking at what is now called the Holocaust. I'm interested in who were the people behind it, who knew what and when did they know it, why did the people who were doing it do it? The questions like that. I'm looking at when people say, well, how many are we talking about? I say, I'm not really interested in figures. I'm interested in the people. And I'm interested in the man who wrote that inside that book too. It does therefore appear that Heinrich Himmler came to a sticky end, a very nasty end, and there's one final clue which I'll put to you, and that concerns the artist, the war artist who made that painting. The painting of the surrender on Lüneburg Heath. That same artist came down to the house in Lüneburg, the house specially prepared for the purpose, if you remember, the house that I'm standing outside. And the same artist was commissioned to do a painting of the surrender of Heinrich Himmler. I think he may even have been in the house when Himmler was still alive, because a bunch of his sketches for his paintings were published later on by the Illustrated London News. The Illustrated London News is a big format photogravure magazine, rather like Signal and Time and Life magazine. And they specialized in having artists who gave renderings of the sinking of the Titanic, and where no cameras were there. And there was no camera in that room either. One of his sketches of a picture of Heinrich Himmler standing, holding up his trousers. Another picture is Heinrich Himmler lying on the floor, already dead. Very good images. You will find them on my website. If you go to my website, /Himmler, capital H, /death, I think you'll probably find it there. The interesting thing is that, like all artists, when he's been commissioned to do a painting, he does a series of thumbnail sketches, little details, people's ears, their shoes, what kind of hats, what kind of their badges, what they look like. He made several sketches of Himmler lying on the floor, Himmler standing there, the British officers, the Russian officers standing there, they're going to be in the painting too. And then he does sketches of the details. And I've got an enlarged sketch here, an enlargement of one of the details here. There it is. This is the head of Heinrich Himmler standing, holding up his trousers. And you can see, like all good artists, he's labeled things. Bushy eyebrows is one thing. Bushy eyebrows, shadow chin, moustache beginning to grow again. And here he writes, broken nose. Broken nose. Well, Himmler's nose wasn't broken when he arrived at that house. Probably wasn't broken after he was dead. Something happened in those 15 minutes that broke his nose. And it all fits in with the general picture of what the guy wrote next to the photograph in the printed book. Heinrich Himmler came to a violent end, not the official version given by the British afterwards, and subsequently the cowardly end, which enraged a lot of SS generals who said, well, he wasn't prepared to take the music, and so now we have to stand up and take the music instead. I've no doubt at all if he'd gone on to Nuremberg, he would have been hanged, and he would have richly deserved it. He was a very strange character. I'm now going to have a look at who Heinrich Himmler was. He was the middle brother of three brothers. Little Ernst was the youngest. The middle one was Heine, born in 1900, and the oldest one was Gebhard, a few years older than him, old enough to see service in World War I, much to the rage, envy, and jealousy of Heinrich Himmler, who had desperately wanted to be part of that group himself, who went to... In World War I, soldiers volunteered. They marched to the colors. They went off with flying flags and the beat of drums and the blare of trumpets to fight on the battlefields, particularly on the Western Front. And Gebhard Himmler, the older, he managed to see action on the Western Front, and he came back at the end of the war with medals and decorations and promotions and stories to tell. Little Heine never got beyond the machine gun training battalion. He was still training on a machine gun battalion when the war ended, so he never actually saw action. And that rankled with him, we'll find. There's a bone of contention between him and his older brother, Gebhard. I knew his brother. I visited Gebhard in 1970. Alas, I was writing my book on Adolf Hitler. I didn't realize that I was going to spend 15 years towards the end of my life writing a book on Heinrich Himmler. Otherwise, I would have spent a lot of time talking about Heine too. But Gebhard and his wife Matilda, who sat in the room with me the whole of that afternoon and evening, Gebhard described to me the character of his brother Heine. And he said, you know, David, Mr. Irving, you're wrong about Himmler and the Holocaust. Because my theory, even then, which I put to him, was that Hitler was not in the loop. That Heine wasn't telling Hitler what he was doing, which I still stick to that theory. And I explain why when we get to that topic. Gerhard Himmler says, I think you're wrong. I think Heine was telling Hitler everything. You've got to realize my brother Heine was a moral coward. He would never have dared to do something as awesome as that, as awful as that, without absolute cover from the top, from Hitler himself. He would never have done that off his own bat. And all I could say was, I could think, I didn't actually say it, I'm too polite for that, I said was, I say, well, Gebhard, I hear what you say, but I don't think you were in the loop either. You yourself have just told me this afternoon that you didn't know that Germany was about to attack Russia when it happened in June 1941. That first you knew was when you read that morning's newspapers, that you were attacking the Soviet Union. Your own brother hadn't told you that Germany was about to attack the Soviet Union. If he kept that from you, he probably kept all the details of the Holocaust from you too, and how much he discussed with Hitler. We'll come to that in a minute. But Heinrich Himmler eventually became police chief of Germany, and Gebhard, the brother, said to me, after he became chief of police of all of Germany and occupied Europe, I remember my brother Heine saying to me once, you know, being chief of police is a dirty job. You're dealing with lowlifes and scum for the rest of your life. Your job is cleaning up all. Reinhard Heydrich, his chief lieutenant, said the same thing to his wife, Lena. I've got Lena's papers. They're here in Michigan, in private hands. Basically, Heine said, a policeman's lot is not a happy one. He was the middle of three brothers. His father was a schoolmaster, a headmaster of one of Munich's most famous schools, the Wilhelmsgymnasium, which is the school where the Bavarian royal family had been brought up. In fact, Heine Himmler's father had been the tutor of the royal family. Prince Heinrich was killed in action in World War I, died a hero's death, and before that he was the godfather to Heine Himmler, which is why Heine Himmler was called Heinrich, named after the famous prince. And the father, the schoolmaster, the headmaster of this famous school, a man I greatly admire. He was obviously very stern and disciplinarian. I think I say in the book, I've written 24 chapters of my Himmler biography already. And I say really fortunate is the young man who has a schoolmaster as a father, let alone a headmaster, because that guy is going to set you on the right tracks for life. And this headmaster was a person who was a stern disciplinarian who stood for no nonsense. And Heinrich Himmler's father obviously told him, for example, I'm going to give you pocket money, but I want you to account every week for every penny that you spend. And Heine Himmler wrote a diary. Beginning with the age of 10, he began writing it. And Germans say to me, that's ridiculous. Little boys of 10 didn't write diaries in Germany at that time. Little girls wrote diaries. They wrote diaries usually with a little lock on so that mummy couldn't open it. But Heine, he was 10 and he wrote a diary. And it's a ridiculous diary. It begins every entry with, got up at 7 in the morning, washed, shaved, had breakfast, did my homework. In the afternoon I went for a walk, wrote my diary. In his diary he writes, I wrote my diary. And historians have pounced on this and say, what a ridiculous diary, what a strange, pedantic kind of person he is. Every penny is accounted for, every penny. So that at the end of the week he can report to his father how he spent the money, the pocket money. And they don't realize the father is a headmaster, for God's sake. The headmaster has said to little 10-year-old Heine, you will write a diary. Every week I will read your diary to see that you have not wasted 1 second, 1 minute of the day that God has given you. And they were a pious family. God, they were pious. Heinrich Himmler, he was never happy than when he was on his bike going around the cathedrals and churches of Bavaria, admiring the architecture and the paintings, and of course standing in awe of the Catholic liturgy, the Catholic rituals. He was a Catholic, admiring the black uniforms, floor-length black uniforms of the clergy, the music, the solemn processions, the midnight mass, and all the other solemn ritual of the Catholic Church, which you can see echoed and reflected and mirrored in the SS that he himself then founded. The black uniforms, the very sharp, cool uniforms of the SS, modeled, some say, on the New Jersey traffic cops. Very similar. You can see the same flaps, the same belts, the same kind of hem lengths and everything. People have said that there was obviously some connection. But in fact, mass-produced by Hugo Black. Hugo Black, he was the mass manufacturer who mass-produced the SS. He had a bit of explaining to do when World War II was over about all the millions he'd made out of manufacturing, not just the SS, but also the main Nazi Party uniforms. Hugo Black. He had died in 1948, but I dare say his family had some confiscations to suffer. Very sharp uniform. I think a lot of young men joined the SS only because of the uniform, because it was so sharp, and it was a real pull-up. It pulled the girls. the SS uniform. Heinrich Himmler, he went to school, he did very well, he went on to university. And in university, he then studied agriculture, and he got his degree in 1922, full degree in agriculture, and he might well have become a farmer or an estate manager or something like that. But there was one thing happened at university. You must understand, German universities, and Austrian universities too, a center pole of their life at university is the fraternity, the Burschenschaft, or the corporation, the student corporation that they joined. And the student corporation that he joined was the Apollo. And the Apollo Corporation in Bavaria was distinguished by the fact that it was what was called a mandatory dueling fraternity. They dueled with swords, not with pistols. They didn't go boxing or anything like that. They actually dueled with sabers. And the duel was very ritualistic. They stood with one arm behind their back, a saber in their right hand. The last 12 inches of that blade were honed to razor sharpness, facing an opponent who faces the other way at arm's length. In fact, the duel in German is called die Mensur, measurement, the range, the distance, die Mensur, which was the distance between the opponents, it was a very formal setting with ritualized ballet steps, so to speak, and pirouetting and sword play like Errol Flynn and the old movies, clash, 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 clash. And each bout was only a few seconds long. And there would be 40 or 50 bouts before the match was ended. And the match ended when blood had been drawn on your opponent's face with a gash, the whole of the rest of his body protected by padding from below the chin and above the eyebrows, protected, but the face exposed as the lawful target area. Slash, 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 try to get through. You were only allowed to parry those blows from your opponent's saber by sword play. Flash, 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 bang, get it away. If he gets through, slashes you, you are not allowed to flinch. Flinching is to lose, to be dishonored. You're not allowed to duck, not allowed to withdraw, to avoid that blade. You've got to stand there, take it like a man. The only defense you've got is to parry the blow with your sword by approved sword play, like Errol Flynn. I'm convinced, the key to the mentality of the German people in World War II, because most of their leaders had been to the mandatory dueling fraternities. And they had learned not to flinch. They had learned to take it like men. And this explains why the German people, as a body, took the appalling slashes, the appalling blows, the air raids, the firestorms, the defeats on the Eastern Front, and all the rest of it. They took it like men to the very end. I don't think even a Hiroshima bomb would have affected them, because they had been brought up in the hard school of dueling fraternities. Otto Skorzeny, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Gestapo, they all had this slash mark on their, Ernst Röhm, of course, they all had the slash on their face as a mark of having gone through it. And it wasn't the actual kind of training and everything that went into it. It wasn't like football games. It was the fact that when you met somebody who had been in the Apollo fraternity or a fraternity like that, you knew that he had been through the same school as you had, and he too could take knocks. And that was a kind of a prerequisite. You would interview with somebody for a director's job in an oil company or something, and the first question you'd ask is, what fraternity did you belong to? And that's the way Germany was always brought out. It was no accident, I think, that when I first went to Germany in the post-war years and started interviewing all these top people, Otto Günscher, for example, the man who burned Hitler's body, he was a former SS man. The SS people were the elite. They automatically rose to the top. And that is something that the people who are outside this elite have not been able to understand. So Heinrich Himmler, he went through university, got his degree, he became chief of police. Meanwhile, his brother was several years ahead of him. His brother Gebhard, the one that I interviewed back in 1970, was several years ahead of him. And the brother he was a success. The brother had a job with a big company, Gebhard. He had an income. He had medals, decorations, war stories to tell. Above all, he had a fiancée. He had a beautiful fiancée called Paula Stolzler. I've got a picture, as I'll show you in a second. You'll understand why. Paula Stolzler was a very nice girl in her late 20s. And Heinrich Himmler was desperately jealous of his older brother having a girlfriend. The first time that Heinrich Himmler was involved with a woman, he stayed pure until he was 28. Heinrich Himmler was pure until he was 28. Eventually he was picked up by a woman in a train, and then again in a hotel lobby, a woman called Marga Boden. She picked him up in a hotel lobby on some pretext. She was 8 years older than him, what they call a cougar. Am I right? A cougar? And she lured him to Berlin and had her wicked way with him. Whereupon Himmler told his brother, and she has given her body to me, so I shall now have to marry her, and I shall be married. And Himmler said, "Are you stupid? You're going to marry that bitch?" and Heinrich said, "Well, it's a decent thing to do." That was typical Himmler. He was a decent, upright, incorruptible young man, a church-going young man. This was his first woman. Now he was going to marry her. This was the obvious thing to do. So he married her, and he had a daughter, Gudrun, who's still alive today. I met her. I met her years ago, I know when, July 1993. I was in the German archives in Koblenz, my very last visit to the German archives. I had just been handed a letter by the German chief of the archives informing me I was now subject to a Hausverbot, no longer allowed to enter the building, in the interest of the German people. And he said, "We're terribly sorry, Mr. Irving." He went bright red. But this had been dictated to us by the Minister of the Interior, so that was a few days before I was banned. And as I was leaving, I saw this woman there, and she came trotting over to me and said, "Oh, Mr. Irving, I'm Gudrun Himmler." "Yes, what are you doing here?" She said, "I wanted to say thank you so much because you've given 2 of my father's diaries to the archives," which is true. They're here in American hands, and I provided complete color copies of these diaries. All his private papers are stolen by the Americans, you see. And I donated these to the German archives. And I said, "May I ask, madam, what you're doing here?" And she said, "Ever since the war ended, I've been writing a book to clear my father's name." And I thought, well, good luck to you, but not very nice. But what a nice daughter to have had. Unlike so many presidential daughters in the United States who go around declaring everything short of "I was abused by my father." Here's Gudrun Himmler standing up for her father. To this very day, she's in her late 80s, still alive, and still doing what she can for her father and also for all his men. Very nice old lady. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Marga Himmler, whose diary I obtained, which I'm going to refer to in the last part of this talk. So little Heinrich Himmler, desperately jealous and envious of his older brother because of the girlfriend Paula Stotzler, and he does what any decent brother would do. He hired a private detective to track this girl around. The reporters in the archives in Stanford, at the university, locked up in their vault. And the detective duly reports. And you can make of it what you want. Yes, she's age 28, 29, and yes, she has been around the block once or twice. Well, what woman of 28 or 29 hasn't been around the block a few times? If somebody hasn't been, then there's something wrong with her. And you steer clear of her. But no, Heinrich Himmler put this on the big bell, as the Germans say, and beat this bell at 3 o'clock in the morning to his brother. And he writes in his diary, "Until 3 o'clock last night, I am pleading with my brother to dump this girl. She is not good enough for him. It doesn't work." And the brother says, no, I like her, and we're together now, and we're engaged, and we're going to go through with this, and stop badgering me about it. And Himmler writes all this down in his wonderful diary. And then a few days later he writes, and there's this business of that painter guy, that guy Ferdinand Meerwald in Dachau. Dachau in those times, 1922, was just a little town outside Munich. Now, of course, Dachau has another reputation, but in those days it was a little artist colony of artists and sculptors. And Ferdinand Meerwald was quite an accomplished artist and sculptor and woodcarver in Dachau. In fact, there's actually a street in Dachau now called Ferdinand Meerwaldstraße. And I checked up on Wikipedia or somewhere to find out what his age was. I mean, Himmler in his diary says there's that boob Meerwald. Well, a boob is normally somebody like a 10 or 12-year-old. But no, Himmler is just angry that this is going on, and that Paula Stotzler, his brother's fiancée, is having it off with this guy as well, this artist. And you click around a bit, and after a couple of days of clicking around, I came to a page of thumbnail sketches of paintings done by Ferdinand Meerwald, which are hanging in the Dachau City Museum to this day. And there's this painting of Paula Stotzler, the actual fiancée, Himmler's brother's fiancée. And I can begin to see the point now. It's signed Ferdinand Meerwald, 1921. And the painter's granddaughter then told me, well, we've actually got 2 more paintings of the same girl, 1922 and 1923. And you can see it's quite a good painting. She's wearing a fur hat. She's looking over her fur-caped shoulder at the artist. Oh, and there's a look in her eyes that says, "I'm up for it, are you?" Right? We know that look, don't we? Ladies won't know, but we know that look. That says she's up for it. She's obviously been up for it for 2 or 3 years. And then I remember, of course, when I went to see the brother Gebhard, the lady whom he introduced me as his wife was called Matilda. So little Heidi managed to kill that relationship entirely with the private detectives and all the rest. I mentioned the diaries. The diaries are so important. I've got a page of the diary here. I mentioned he began writing this diary from the age of 10. And I've shown these to my German historian friends, and they say, oh yes, now that's handwriting, that is German, isn't it? I mean, they look at it and they can't tell what it says. Fortunately, over a lifetime of crime, I've had to learn to read this old German handwriting. And Himmler wrote that same handwriting from the very first moment right through to the end of his life. Very characteristic handwriting, although Adolf Hitler ruled in about 1942 that all Germans were now to switch over to writing in Latin handwriting, our handwriting, Roman script. Himmler continued using this ancient Gothic handwriting until the end. And the only reason I mention this diary here is because this is the diary of January the 12th, 1922. 1922. The diary ends in about 1924 as far as the surviving diaries go. After that he writes a more kind of agenda kind of diary, which is still useful but not as informative as this. And this contains his first reference that we know about to the Jews, which is why the historians pounce on it. I've had the actual diary taken out of the safe, and I've asked them to make a very nice digital scan of that page, because Stanford University keeps all these actual original documents in a safe, and you're normally required to use white on black negative copies. But here, Himmler refers to the Jews. His father, the schoolmaster, had a lawyer in Munich. The lawyer's name was Oskar Gerstler, and he writes a letter to Oskar Gerstler, and he writes in his diary, I pay a visit to the attorney, Dr. Oskar Gerstler, to hand him a letter that my father has written. Utterly amiable and extremely friendly he is, but he can't conceal the Jew within. When all is said and done, he may well be a jolly good chap, but that's how they are, these people. It's in their blood. He spoke a lot about society and about people he knows and networking, and at the finish he said, if he could ever be of service to me, he'd be more than happy. I've got a lot of fraternity friends, he said, but even so, you can see there's a kind of an element of distaste in that entry. And then he makes it even more marked by a concluding dig. He says, oh, he wasn't in the war, incidentally, because he had a heart problem. In other words, he was a George W. Bush kind of guy, kind of joined the National Guard, but never actually went for any sessions, but he could get deferment, he wouldn't be sent anywhere. All the warmongers in the United States, all your current warmongers, like John Bolton and the rest, they're all people who want other people to go and do war for them, but it turns out they've all been draft dodgers at the time of Vietnam and more recently. There was I saw a very good interview on CNN a few nights ago where the guy actually admitted this. But no, very good commentator on CNN. He said, I admit I'm a coward. He said, I do not want to go and do combat. He said, and I would try to avoid the draft if the time came, and I would try to avoid enlistment. But then I wouldn't go around asking other people to go and fight wars either, which seems to be the character. And then he named the same people that I've had my eye on. Well, Himmler says the same about this guy. He says, I, Heinrich Himmler, always wanted to go to the World War I, desperately wanted to be in uniform, but other kinds of people, they did what they could to avoid it. This lawyer, for example, he says, he wasn't in the war, incidentally, because of a heart problem. You know exactly what Heinrich Himmler is writing in the diary there, but even so, despite all that, I don't think he's anti-Semitic at this time. I don't think that displays any greater degree of anti-Semitism than there was probably in Munich society at that time. I think Munich at that time, 1922, was probably riddled with anti-Semitism, the kind of society, university courses that he attended. The Jews were the recent immigrants. They were nasty, unshaven, dirty, smelly, ill people in the eyes of the public. And long before the Nazis came to power, the city of Munich and the governor of Bavaria did what they could to get the Jews expelled from Bavaria. So Himmler was just here basically echoing what he heard in the kind of society that he lived in. There's nothing markedly homicidally anti-Semitic in those remarks. He just says, well, it's in their blood, they can't help it. Other historians, of course, have pounced on that and said, there you have it. That is the first clue, the acorn from which the oak of the Holocaust ultimately grew. And this I don't think so at all. But I do go further than other historians. I then checked up on what happened to Oskar Gerstler, because I know that people want to know what I'm going to be writing about Heinrich Himmler and the Holocaust. In fact, my Jewish friends in Atlanta, one of them, he says, come on, David, you've written 24 chapters already. You haven't got to the Holocaust yet? That's all what people want to hear about. And I said, it's maybe what you want to hear about, but I've got readers who are interested in how things happen. Everything, and they need to know the whole story. These things don't happen in a vacuum. You have to have the space-time context, the background against which they happen. And that's what I'm writing now. Well, he said, but eventually I put in Oscar, I followed what happened to Oscar Gerster, this lawyer. And I say that at the end of the chapter, I say the last we see of him is 20 years later, almost to the day. He's standing on a railway platform in Munich with all his baggage, about to board the second deportation train from Munich to Poland, where all the Jews are being deported from Poland, from Munich to Poland, and he's being deported to a little village beginning with a P. I don't know, I can't remember the name of it. And he's never seen again. All I can say is he was never seen again from that date he boarded that train. Now, he didn't even go to Palestine. He's on the memorial list of dead lawyers in Munich now. We presume he came to a sticky end. He had a very nasty time in between, of course, between the time of that letter and the time of boarding that train, because in 1936, a deranged Jew called David Frankfurter killed a German leader in Switzerland, Nazi leader in Switzerland, whose name was Wilhelm Gustloff. That rings a bell, doesn't it? Wilhelm Gustloff, after whom a cruise liner was named, one of the German trades union cruise liners. And the Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed in January 1945 by a Soviet submarine with a loss of 7,000 lives. You don't hear much about it. You hear a lot about the Titanic. You don't hear about these appalling sinkings of cruise liners in the last weeks of the war, each time with many thousands of refugees on board. Wilhelm Gustloff, he was murdered by David Frankfurter in 1936. And along comes Adolf Hitler and issues a secret circular saying, I want no kind of reprisals whatsoever against the Jewish community. And I don't think Adolf Hitler was anti-Semitic either when it came to actions. Every time you see actions connected with Adolf Hitler, he's putting out his hand to stop things happening to the Jews. He's in power, he doesn't need anti-Semitism anymore. It's been a very useful ticket to power. Once you're in power, you don't need to do the things. It didn't stop his minions, Bormann and Goebbels and the others. They were the anti-Semites who then drove the engine that became the murderous machine. Hitler himself tried to stop it. 1938, there was another murder by another deranged Jew. It's always a deranged Jew who does the murdering. This time in Paris, a German diplomat was assassinated, and that led to the Night of Broken Glass. And on that occasion, Hitler ordered 20,000 Jews rounded up and thrown into prison for 2 weeks as a short, sharp shock. Just say that this time is 2 weeks. If it happens again, they can expect to be put away for rather longer. And poor Oscar Gerster, the lawyer, he did what he could to try and emigrate, but he couldn't. He was refused permission, he didn't meet the qualifications, and he was still in Germany when the emigrations were stopped. And he vanished in January 1942, boarding that train, never seen again. You ask about the Holocaust, you ask how many people, you ask how big it was, and I will say that I'm interested in people, I'm not interested in numbers. But to give an idea of the size of what happened under Himmler's rule, I will give you two documents only to chew over. When the German armies invaded Russia in June 1941, there were 4 army groups, and behind each of those 4 army groups there followed an Einsatzgruppe. I call it a task force. And each of these Einsatzgruppen consisted of several rolling mobile commands, Einsatzkommandos, each of about 10 or 15 four-wheel vehicles, jeeps, laden with 4 or 5 Sicherheitsdienst officers, and an ammunition truck and a food wagon. And they would visit town after town where the Jews had been rounded up with the assistance of the local Jewish council, who collaborated with the Nazis at every stage, and they were liquidated by the Einsatzkommandos. I've got one document here from the Russian archives, which I found in the Russian archives. I'm going to read it to you. I've got it here. It consists of 2 documents. The first of all, they come from the archives of Kaun, the German security police in Kaun, which is now Kaunas in Lithuania, second city in Lithuania, Kovno, and it's directed to them from Riga, the head of the German security police in Riga, which is where basically all the Baltic operations were being conducted from by Himmler's police officers. I'll read it to you. You can see this is the telegram received in Kaun, telegram strips, and it says, addressed to the Einsatzkommando 3 in Reval, Einsatzkommando 3B in Kovno, subject executions. We request immediately a report on the number of the executions that you've carried out, divided according to Jews, communists, partisans, mentally sick, and others. And of the overall total, how many were women and how many children? February the 1st, 1942, February the 6th, 1942 is that document. Signed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Security Police in Ostland, the Baltic states, to the Einsatzkommando 3 in Kovno. And Jäger, SS Standartenführer, colonel in Riga, replies to the Einsatzgruppe as follows, gives the numbers. He obviously writes his reply in handwriting, and it then goes off to be telegraphed to Riga, again from the Moscow archives. You request executions up to the 1st of February 1942, so that's about 7 months by this one rolling command, the Einsatzkommando 3. A, Jews, 136,421. B, communists, 1,064. C, partisans, 56. D, mentally sick. And 56 is quite a low number for partisans when you come to think of it. D, mentally sick, 653. E, Poles, 44. Russians, 628. Gypsies, 5. Armenians, 1. Overall total, 138,272. Of which women, 55,556. Children, 34,464. And that makes you pause for a minute and even gasp until you reflect, well, that's probably as many children as we killed in Dresden in 1 hour in 1945. Burned them alive. I'm not trying to say that one thing justifies the other, but you only hear normally, when you hear history nowadays, you're only hearing the one side of the story, as all these things happened in a vacuum. I think myself that those are genuine documents. 138,000 in 7 months, divided by the number of teams. I mean, that means that each man killed about 10 people per day in the rolling units. It's not too desperate. It's not too implausible. But you've got to realize it was just one aspect of the killing operations that Himmler commanded. Very interesting that you find in the Moscow archives a number of other documents that you don't see often quoted. One is a document where Himmler, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders, says that the Reichsführer SS, that's Heinrich Himmler, has told us he does not want to receive our reports. The reports need not be sent up to him. Well, if they weren't sent up to him, then they definitely didn't reach as far as Adolf Hitler. He was quite happy to leave it in the hands of the local Einsatzgruppen commanders to do as they saw fit, and he didn't want to be bothered with the details. That's, I think, probably par for the course. It rather reminds me of your American Army commander at the time of the invasion of Iraq, who was asked about Iraqi civilian casualties, and his answer on television was, "We don't do body counts." The same kind of thing. I remember seeing that at the time, thinking that kind of rings a bell. We're not into doing body counts. This was one class of killing that went on. When the attack on Russia began, Operation Barbarossa, obviously Hitler gave to Himmler the job of securing the rear areas behind the advancing armies. Police operations, cleansing operations, probably the same as they go on in Afghanistan and Iraq today. And we don't hear very much about them either, probably just as well. But after a time, these operations changed in character. From about September 1941 onwards, they began taking the women and children too. And Himmler justified this in a very famous speech in October 1943 in Poznan, where he said, "A lot of you SS generals in front of me understand why we were killing the Jews, but you don't understand why we were killing the women and children too." He said, "Well, you've got to realize that women are just as lethal as men in partisan warfare. And as for the children, there's no point leaving them alive, and they're going to come back 2 generations later to take their revenge on us." Which makes a kind of logical sense, except basically it's illogical, because you've allowed 2 million to emigrate to America. So he's not really thinking straight. But gradually the operation changed its character, in my mind, from being a police operation to more pragmatic and ideological. We're going to cleanse the whole of the East of the Jews. Willy-nilly, we're just going to throw them all into pits and kill them. Incidentally, that speech I just mentioned, the one that Himmler made, a very famous speech, undoubtedly he used those words because they're on a wire recording in the National Archives. And yet there's 2 versions of the speech. If you look at that page has been retyped by somebody different, on a different typewriter with different carbon paper. And the pagination changes from before that page up to that page. The pagination is typed in. From that page on, every page is numbered by handwriting. So for some reason, that speech has been typed twice. And you can surmise perhaps he wanted 2 versions of the speech, one for the SS archives as he actually said it, and one for somebody else who's not going to be told what we're doing. Adolf Hitler, that's my view. He's going to bring me, which I'll give more evidence for that in a second. I don't think Himmler was telling Hitler what he was up to. SS General Karl Wolff, his chief of staff, a man I knew, very handsome, tall, Aryan, aristocratic, arrogant, a rather cowardly man who did what he could in the last week or 2 of the war to save his own skin. Karl Wolff went into Himmler's bunker one night in the summer of 1942 pushed the door open at 3 in the morning and found Himmler was still at his desk. But he was sitting at the desk with his head in his hands, looking at the picture of dejection. And Himmler thinks there's a personal problem connected with Himmler's mistress, Hedwig Potthast, and he says, "What's up, boss? Is this business with Haitian, with Bunny, as she was called?" And Himmler said, No. He said, "You've got to understand," he said, "I'm doing something that the Messiah of the coming 2,000 years must never hear about, so that his reputation remains immaculate." And Karl Wolff said, "At the time, I didn't know what he was referring to." "Oh, yes, you did." We know what Karl Wolff knew, but he tells history in interviews afterwards he didn't quite understand what Himmler was referring to. But it's quite obvious that Himmler was actually saying that what he was doing in the killing pits and elsewhere, he wasn't telling Hitler about, so that Hitler's reputation would remain pure. That I do believe, because Karl Wolff repeats this sentence again and again and again over 30 years of his life. It's always the same sentence, what Himmler said to him. His head in his hands, "I'm doing something the Messiah of the coming 2,000 years must never hear about." This brings us to the second part of the operation. And this is Operation Reinhardt. Now this was a straightforward ideological killing operation that went on particularly in Poland. Every Polish city emptied town by town systematically, and the Jewish occupants being sent to 4 camps along the Bug River in eastern Poland. I've been to all these 4 sites: Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka, and Majdanek, or Lublin, a suburb of Lublin. S, M, T, and L. And we have a wonderful document which tells us what was going on. It's this. This is one of the most crucial documents, as I mentioned earlier, of World War II. This document gives figures for Operation Reinhardt. Operation Reinhardt was overseen by a Vienna Gauleiter called Odilo Globocnik, who was based in Lublin. The chief of his Reinhardt desk for Operation Reinhardt was an SS major called Hermann Höfler. We intercepted a telegram from Höfler to Berlin on January the 11th, 1943. He's been asked to give the figures so far, a breakdown of how far Operation Reinhardt has got in 1942. And first of all, he gives, I'll show you what this is. The first 2 lines are a telegram to Adolf Eichmann, of all people. But the rest of the telegram wasn't picked up. It says text missing, because, let's face it, you're listening to primitive messages being broadcast in Morse by a radio transmitter 2,000 miles away from England. And you don't always get everything, and you've got to get the whole thing or the code machine won't work. So the first message, we only got 2 lines of it. The next message, we got the whole message 5 minutes later. Top state secret, addressed to the Commander-in-Chief of Security Police, to be handed to Colonel Heim in Krakow. Subject, 14-day report on Operation Reinhardt. 14 days up to 31st of December 1942. Figures are L 12,761, B 0, S 515, T 10,335, altogether 23,611, the last 2 weeks of 1942. And then you come to the overall figure since Reinhardt began in the spring of 1942 up to the end of 1942. Very ugly figures indeed. L 24,733, B Belzec 434,508. S, Sobibor, 101,370, T, 71,355, altogether 1,274,166. What it doesn't say is what he's talking about. It could be Jews, it could be shoes, we don't know what he's talking about. I've been to all these sites, these 4 Reinhardt camps. They're still there, you can go there. There are usually a little plaque there set up to commemorate what happened there, but it's just a bald patch in the middle of a forest. There's nothing for tourists to go and look at. Like Auschwitz, we've got buildings to look at. Most of them fake. The gas chamber at Auschwitz, built in 1948, believe it or not, and it's got windows. What gas chamber has windows in? And a 4-inch gap under the door at the back. It's a drafty gas chamber, that gas chamber. I mean, they actually, the Poles now admit it. On the plaque outside that gas chamber they showed to tourists, it's a very small print that said this building was erected in 1948. Hello, the war ended 3 years before that. Well, it's kind of symbolic. Symbolic of what? The real sites where the real killing took place were Operation Reinhardt along the eastern part of Poland, where you got to sit in a bus for 4 or 5 hours. There's no Holiday Inn, there's no McDonald's, there's no hot dog stand in the car park, as there is at Auschwitz. There's no nearby airport at Krakow, and so nobody goes there. And that's where it all happened, the real ugly. But what is the proof that he's talking about Jews? Well, the answer is this. The Nazis had now been in power 10 years. Himmler tells his chief statistician, Richard Korher, to draw up a 10-year report on the final solution of the Jewish problem. I've got that. I knew Korher. He was a little guy, typical statistician. And statisticians are only interested in numbers. They're rather like accountants. I hope there's no accountants present. An accountant is somebody, it has once been said, accountant is somebody who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And it's the same as statisticians. They just like numbers. Like this telegram here, it's numbers. With numbers, you can operate. You can divide and add and subtract and do calculus. You can draw a histogram. You can make pie charts. You can do wonderful pictures of numbers. Who cares what the numbers of? And that's what Richard Korher was. He wrote this report for Himmler. The first 10 years of the Nazis' final solution of the Jewish problem, 17 pages long. He says, when we came to power, there were 17 million Jews in the world. Of those, 10 million were living in Europe. Of those 10 million who were living in Europe in 1933, there are now 4 million living in Europe. And then the statistician in him kicks in. He says, well, the difference is explained by the fact there's large-scale emigration. Oh, and second-order statistician then kicks in. Of those who emigrated, most were childbearing age, young folks. Those who stayed behind were the geriatrics beyond childbearing age, and so there's been further skewing. Oh, and also we subjected 1,274,166 to special treatment in the camps in occupied Poland. Yes, that same 7-digit number, 1,274,166, have been subjected to special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, in the camps in occupied Poland. And now comes the killer. Heinrich Himmler writes him a letter and says, wonderful report, but you've written it too long. I want you to shorten it because it's going to be shown to the Führer, Adolf Hitler. And I want you to change that sentence so it reads, 1.274 million have been channeled through the camps in occupied Poland further east. Somebody's having the wool pulled over his eyes. And the proof of that is quite clear. In fact, Himmler says, he sends that report to Korher, says, thank you very much. He then sends the short report to Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the Gestapo, with the schmiss, the scar on his face. And he says, Mr. Kaltenbrunner, this is an excellent report that Dr. Korher has drawn up. It will be very useful for camouflage purposes. Aus Tarnungsgründen. There's no other way of translating that. They've drawn up this report as a cover document, window dressing. It's going to be very useful for camouflage purposes. It's going to be shown to Hitler. It bears me out all the way along that Hitler was not aware of what was happening and probably didn't want to be aware. And I grant you, he may have said, Heine, do what you consider to be necessary. I don't have to be told. You're chief of police. Don't fill me in. Keep me out of it. He may have said that. There's no evidence that he did. And that's all that I'm going to say about the Holocaust. I've given you some numbers to chew over, which are horrific enough. And they're collateral numbers, which show that the 1.274 million of 1942 was probably the same number in 1943, because in Stanford University there are 2 letters written by Globotschnik, head of Operation Reinhardt, to Himmler, giving the total loot seized in 1942 in Operation Reinhardt, and the loot seized in 1943 in Operation Reinhardt, how many gold watches, how many fountain pens, how many kilograms of gold and all the rest of it, how many diamonds, and you can do the algebra on those 2 lists based on the number you know for 1942, and you come to a large number. But as I say, I'm not going to go into anything, I'm not going to dwell on the numbers, except it's very interesting that Korher makes no reference at all to Auschwitz, because I don't think Auschwitz was a killing center. I think they may have bumped off a few people in Auschwitz in the little houses around the back outside the perimeter fence. I don't think they had any major killing center in Auschwitz, but it's a handy tourist place to send people now. And that brings me now finally to the 4th part of this talk, which is what did Himmler know about the attempt on Hitler's life. And I'm first of all going to mention the principle which has become a guiding principle for me, and it involves your friend Bernie Madoff. Now, all of us lost money with Bernie Madoff. No, we didn't, of course, because we weren't part of his group. I mean, we're very sorry for Eli Wiesel that he lost. Well, I'm sorry if anybody loses $30 million to Bernie Madoff like Eli Wiesel. He lost. I mean, did you lose $30 million? No. None of us had 30. I wonder where Eli Wiesel got his 30 million. Anyway, he told the newspapers that Bernie Madoff had made off with, I'm sorry, Bernie Madoff had lost $30 million of his money. And my heart began to bleed for Mr. Wiesel until I realized what the snag was. But the man investigating the Madoff case, Irving Pickard, he's the trustee, whose job it is to get all the money back, if he can, and distribute it fairly to the people who lost. Irving Pickard, he then developed the principle. He said, when you're looking at the banks and asking for proof that they knew what Madoff was up to, He said, you're not going to find the proof because they're too clever for that. But even if they can say they didn't know, they should have known what he was up to. And it's the should have known which becomes interesting in the case of Heinrich Himmler. Because Heinrich Himmler, in July 1944, the bomb went off on July the 20th under Hitler's table, planted by Colonel Stauffenberg. At that time, Heinrich Himmler was not just chief of the SS, chief of the Gestapo. He also had at his fingertips the letter censorship office. He also had total access to the wiretap agency, the Forschungsamt, as far as internal security was concerned. At his beck and call, he also had access to the code breakers. All of these play a part in what I'm going to tell you. Colonel Stauffenberg put the bomb under Hitler's table at lunchtime on July the 20th, 1944. And this time I'm going to give you straight away the red flag that only came later on. In the case, for example, of what happened to Himmler in that room at the end of his life, the red flag, namely the handwritten scrawl beside the photograph, only came to me after I'd already developed my own theories in that direction. This time, the red flag came halfway through my investigation of what Himmler knew. And it came when I was in prison in Vienna. In prison, you've got time on your hands, you can think. And you lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, except every hour the light comes on for 5 minutes, of course, which is, I suppose, natural. And you're lying there as they turn the light on to make sure you haven't hanged yourself. If you're going to hang yourself, you're going to wait till the light goes off, and then you've got 55 minutes to hang yourself, which is good enough, I suppose. And you lie there thinking, and I was writing, half the day I was writing my memoirs, 2,000 pages I've written, and the other half I was writing Heinrich Himmler. And you realize after a time that this is a wonderful time for recapping on your memoirs. You find that your memory is like an onion, where you peel off one layer of familiar memory, and underneath there's a long forgotten piece of memory. I remember lying there one night thinking, it's a pity, your very first class at school, the kindergarten, when you were 5 or 6, you can remember the entire class list, but only up to the letter I. Allison, Andrews, Chester, Cox, Diebold, Eaton, Freeman, Gemmell, Green, Hodge, Hutt, Irving 1, Irving 2. That's my twin brother. And it's blanked after that. And one morning I'm lying there, 3 in the morning, looking at the empty bunk above me, and I suddenly realized, wait a minute, there's the next layer. Irving 1, Irving 2, Johnson, Jones, Matthews, Morland, Padfield, Pinkerton, Porteous, Rawlings, Sullivan, and so on. It's come back to you. And I'm reading the diary of Marga Himmler, the cougar. I've managed to obtain a copy of 400 pages of her handwritten diary covering the period 1937 to 1945. And she wrote the diary backwards in bits. I write it down day by day by day. That's Jiminy Cricket on my shoulder telling me, wagging his finger at me, have you done enough today? Rather like Heinrich Himmler, panicking, age 10, I've got to have a 7, wrote my diary. I do. No, she wrote a diary which is retrospective. Oh, 2 weeks ago at Easter Sunday, and then on Easter Monday we went and had tea with the Ribbentроps, and on the following day we did that, and so on. And I spent a lot of my time in that prison cell with the pencil, filling in dates, trying to reconstruct dates. And I got to July, the end of July, and then suddenly I realized there it was. I'm lying in bed. Wait a minute. She writes July the 20th. The first I heard of what had happened at the Führer's headquarters was when I arrived in Gmund that evening. And it's staring you in the face. Gmund, that was their family house in southern Germany, in Bavaria. Berlin was where her station was. She was chief of the Red Cross in Berlin. That was her post. But no, she's arriving in Berlin that evening. She has been sent out of Berlin by her husband. And it's a 10-hour train journey from Berlin to Munich, another couple of hours from Munich railway station down to Gmund, where the family house was. She must have been sent out of Berlin sometime that morning, or possibly the evening before. Heine had said, Marga, I want you and Gudrun out of Berlin. Any time now, the balloon's going to go up. Just as 10 years before, he had ordered police protection for his wife and child on the night of Long Knives against Ernst Röhm. This is what begins to make you think, wait a minute. This means that Heinrich Himmler probably knew on the evening of 19th of July that something was about to happen, and he wanted his wife in safety, out of Berlin, because they'd be rounding up the opposition, the traitors. They'd be rounding up all the ministers and their wives that they could get their hands on. And then you begin thinking, wait a minute, he had the wiretap agency there. All these plotters, we know from their diaries, they were telephoning with each other constantly about their plans, no doubt using totally euphemistic camouflage language that nobody in their right minds could understand what they're talking about. And they're using totally fake names. For example, one of the plotters, a man called Langbane, he's referred to as Mr. Shortleg, that kind of thing, which is a bit of a giveaway. But more than that, the bomb was put under Hitler's table by Colonel Stauffenberg, a traitor. I mean, I call them all traitors. Why not? Because these are all men who got their medals and promotion and ranks and uniforms and pay from Adolf Hitler, their head of state, to whom they'd sworn an oath of loyalty. And here they are, because things are going slightly through a crummy patch, now they're going to kill the guy. They're traitors. There's no other word for it, rather like Mr. Pollard at present. They don't care. Stauffenberg had had a nasty war. He'd had an excellent war until May 1943, when a British plane shot up his car, his Jeep, in North Africa, in Tunisia. And this plane had shot off several of his fingers, he shot away his other hand, blown out one eye, and he was badly injured and shipped back to Germany immediately for convalescence. And the war ended in Tunisia halfway through May 1943, and his commanding general, General von Broich, 10th Panzer Division, was taken prisoner and sent to England. And every day, every week after that, Stauffenberg wrote letters to von Broich in England, his old commanding officer, as officers would. And Stauffenberg is such a naive nincompoop, he thinks that once you've licked down the flap on that envelope and put it in the mailbox in Kurfürstendamm, nobody else is going to read it until he gets to England, right? No, it's opened by the Gestapo, by Himmler's letter censorship office in Berlin. It's then sent to Switzerland, where it's opened by the Swiss, the protecting power, who then forward it to England, where it's opened by both MI6 and MI19, who handle the prisoners of war. And it then finally goes down to the prison camp in Latimer, Buckinghamshire, where General von Broich is sitting with his pals in this lovely English country mansion, having beautiful Sunday lunches every day, unaware that hidden microphones in every fitting, ventilator and lamp fitting, record every whispered word they exchange with each other. And von Broich reads the letter out to his pals, which is how I know what the letters say. I've read 100,000 pages of transcripts of these overheard conversations. And Stauffenberg is saying things like, any day now, we've managed to win new recruits. Field Marshal von Witzleben has joined us. We're hoping to win General Fromm as well. And all the names of the plotters are there, except for Stauffenberg himself. But it's quite plain to anybody who reads all these letters and other letters from other members of the conspiracy, what's going on. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. So Himmler is in charge of the Letter Censorship Bureau, and he must be presumed to know what's going on. But there's an even better source. One of the traitors to the traitors was a man called Hans Bernd Gisevius. Gisevius was an Abwehr officer who wrote a book called To the Very End, To the Bitter End. Because he was a member of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service under Canaris, which had been wound up and subsumed by the SS, because he was a member of the Abwehr, Gisevius was able to commute between Berlin and Switzerland. So every 2 or 3 weeks, Gisevius went to Switzerland and commuted commuted to and fro. And in Switzerland, he spent the whole day with your friend Alan Dulles, chief of the OSS in Switzerland. He was a traitor. In other words, he was telling Alan Dulles and the OSS all the preparations for the plot against Adolf Hitler. Alan Dulles reported on these faithfully as a good officer back to Washington, D.C., to Wild Bill Donovan, chief of the OSS. Alan Dulles, of course, became the first chief of the CIA, and I would like to think that the CIA has become more efficient since then. I would like to think that well, I'll practice saying that in front of a mirror until it comes out convincingly. Alan Dulles was chief of the OSS in Switzerland, and he reported by telegram back to Washington every 2 or 3 weeks on the progress of the anti-Hitler plot in Berlin. He reported by strip code. The strip codes of the OSS were 100% being read by the SS codebreakers. Eventually, Gisevius, who comes and goes in Berlin as well, goes to Bern, slaps down on the desk of Alan Dulles in Bern in Switzerland an intercepted telegram and says, you do realize that our codebreakers in the SS are reading every single telegram you send back to Washington, D.C. So Himmler knew from the intercepted telegrams the names of all the plotters. Alan Dulles, of course, mentions this very, very gently in his memoirs. He says, Gisevius came and told me that, and we were momentarily embarrassed, but we concluded that the SS couldn't have read very much. And anyway, I'd always been careful not to put the real names of the plotters in there. Yes, you had. All the real names are in his telegrams. You can go to the archives, you can check on this. So there's a cast list of the anti-Hitler plot being broadcast to Washington and to the SS by your friend Alan Dulles. On July the 19th, 1944, the day before the bomb goes up, the chief of the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, comes in to see Hitler with a letter in which he recommends that now is the time for us to round up the gang and pounce, beginning with the arrest of Field Marshal von Witzleben and General Fromm. Himmler writes across this in his handwriting, no, the time is not yet ripe. What an embarrassment. And the day before the bomb goes off, Karl Wolff, his chief of staff, claims to have sat opposite him when the telephone call came reporting the bomb has gone off. And he, in his interviews, he said, I got the distinct impression that this was not news to my chief, Heinrich Himmler. So what is the explanation for Himmler pausing? doing nothing. Well, it's like a Ponzi scheme again. If you're a member of a Ponzi scheme, Eli Wiesel or anybody else, the secret is to get out in time. If you get out too early, you're missing some of the cream. If you get out too late, there's no cream to be missed. With the conspiracy, as I said at the beginning, if I round up the conspiracy and catch all the plotters, then I'm the hero. If poor old Adolf goes for a Burton, if he buys it, it's tough on him, but on the other hand, I'm next in line to fill his shoes. So it's a win-win situation for Heinrich Himmler. But the secret is, of course, to move at the right time. He waited 1 or 2 days too long. He was going to use the identified conspirators as flypaper to catch the rest. And that would have been his excuse. And unfortunately, the bomb went off first. He may have wondered how they were going to do it, because to get close to Adolf Hitler, you had to have a pass that gets you into the innermost security zone, Sperrkreis A. And none of the identified plotters had that security pass. Himmler didn't know about Stauffenberg, because Gisevius hadn't mentioned Stauffenberg as being one of the active plotters. Gisevius hated Stauffenberg. So Stauffenberg didn't come above Himmler's radar in the intercepted, decoded telegrams. I still haven't sorted all this out in my own mind. When I come to that in the chapter of my book, which I shall work on in a few months' time, then I shall straighten things out. I'm going to have a look at all the records again and come to a conclusion. But as you see, when you look at the original records, you do come to different conclusions. It's worth going the extra mile, whether it's in the case of the girlfriend who was shot down by Heinrich Himmler over the artist, or over the telegrams, over the war diaries that have been interfered with and rewritten, because it's always worth going the extra mile. And if I'm known for one thing, it's that as a historian, I do go the extra mile. Thank you very much for listening so much. Thank you.